Mercury never moves backward. It never has. Not once in 4.5 billion years, but 3 to 4 times every year. Your phone lights up with the same warning anyway. Mercury is in retrograde. Protect yourself. Do not sign contracts. Do not buy electronics. Do not start anything new. And for the next 3 weeks, millions of people brace for chaos, convinced the universe just shifted into reverse. But here is what almost nobody telling you to panic has ever actually explained: where this idea came from, what the original teaching said, and why the ancient astronomers who first tracked Mercury's movement would barely recognize what the internet has done with their work. That story starts about 2,600 years ago, on a clay tablet in Babylon, and it has almost nothing to do with what you've been told. You have probably seen the posts. They show up on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, in your inbox, and on at least a dozen YouTube channels you follow. Mercury retrograde starts on this date, ends on that date, and somewhere in between, your text messages will go haywire, your flights will get delayed, your ex will text you at 2 in the morning, and your laptop will crash during the one presentation that actually matters. The warnings come with the certainty of a weather forecast and the urgency of an emergency broadcast. Some accounts add a shadow period before and after the retrograde itself, stretching the danger zone even longer. Others list specific zodiac signs that will be hit hardest, turning a planetary transit into a personalized threat. And the advice that follows these warnings is almost always the same. Lay low. Avoid major decisions. Do not start new relationships. Do not launch new projects. Wait it out. Protect your energy. Basically, put your life on hold until Mercury straightens out. Think about what that actually means for a second. 3 to 4 times per year, for roughly 3 weeks each time, an entire belief system tells you that the universe is working against you. That is 9 to 12 weeks annually, nearly a quarter of your year spent in a state of low-grade cosmic dread. If you add the shadow periods that some astrologers insist on including, you could be spending close to half the year in some version of retrograde anxiety. And if you have been following astrology content online for any length of time, you have absorbed this message so deeply that you might not even question it anymore. Retrograde equals bad. Everybody knows that. But everybody is wrong, not a little wrong. Fundamentally, historically, astronomically wrong. And the real story is far more interesting than the panic version. Mercury, as a planet, orbits the Sun in the same direction it always has, at the same speed it always has, on the same orbital path it has traveled since the solar system formed. When your favorite astrology account tells you Mercury is going backward, they are describing an optical illusion. That is not a metaphor or a simplification. It is literally what is happening in the sky. Picture yourself in a car on the highway, cruising in the right lane at 50 miles an hour. A faster car passes you on the left at 70. As it pulls ahead, watch it against the distant background of trees or mountains. For a brief moment, as it rounds a curve ahead of you, its position against the far horizon seems to shift backward, even though it is still moving forward and pulling away. Your eye sees a reversal that is not really there. That is the geometry of Mercury retrograde. Mercury orbits the Sun much closer than Earth does, on a tighter inside track, and it moves much faster. Mercury completes a full orbit in just 88 days. Earth takes 365, so roughly 3 to 4 times per year. Mercury laps Earth on its faster inner orbit, and during the period when it is rounding the curve closest to us and pulling ahead on the far side, its apparent position in the sky appears to slow down, stop, and reverse direction for about 3 weeks before resuming its forward path. Every planet in the solar system beyond Earth exhibits this same illusion at its own interval. But Mercury gets all the attention because its retrograde happens most frequently, and because pop astrology assigned it rulership over communication, technology, and travel, the things people notice disruptions in most readily. But here is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the fact that retrograde is an optical illusion does not mean it was dismissed by the ancient world. Quite the opposite. The people who first tracked this phenomenon took it extremely seriously. They just drew completely different conclusions from it than the ones you find on social media. The earliest detailed records of planetary retrograde motion come from Mesopotamia, from the civilization we call Babylon, in the river valley between the Tigris and Euphrates in what is now modern Iraq. Babylonian astronomers, working somewhere between 600 and 400 BCE, maintained meticulous records of planetary positions on cuneiform clay tablets. Some of these tablets still survive today. You can see them in the British Museum in London. They are small, roughly palm-sized, covered in the wedge-shaped script that Babylonian scribes pressed into wet clay with reed styluses. Most were originally sun-dried rather than kiln-fired. Many of the ones that survived to the present day were accidentally baked hard when the buildings and libraries that housed them burned down during conquests and sieges. Fire destroyed the archives but preserved the clay, which is one of history's more useful ironies. These tablets contain some of the most precise astronomical observations of the ancient world. The astronomers who created them were not hobbyists or mystics working in isolation. They were professionals. They operated from temple complexes in cities like Babylon and Uruk, funded by the state, reporting their observations directly to the king. Astronomical accuracy was a matter of political and religious significance. The movements of the planets were believed to carry messages about the fate of the kingdom, the health of the king, and the timing of harvests and floods. Getting the observations wrong was not merely embarrassing, it could be dangerous. These astronomers tracked Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn across the night sky with remarkable accuracy, recording when each planet appeared to change direction. They called these moments turnings. A planet would reach its turning point, appear to retrace its steps across the background of fixed stars for a period, and then turn again to resume its forward journey. The Babylonians logged these turnings alongside eclipses, lunar phases, and the rising and setting of specific star groups, building an astronomical record that spanned centuries. The most important collection of these records is a series known as the Enuma Anu Enlil, a massive compilation of celestial observations and omens that eventually grew to roughly 70 tablets. This was not casual record-keeping. It was a multi-generational project, with each generation of astronomers adding to and refining the observations of their predecessors. By the later period of Babylonian astronomy, around the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, these scholars had developed mathematical techniques sophisticated enough to predict planetary positions, including retrograde stations, with accuracy that would not be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years. Now, the Babylonians were not simply neutral observers recording data points without interpretation. The Enuma Anu Enlil is, at its core, an omen collection. The astronomers did assign meaning to planetary turnings, and some of those meanings were cautionary. But the critical distinction is who those omens were for. Babylonian celestial omens concerned the king, the state, the harvest, and the military. They were messages about the fate of the kingdom, read by court professionals for political and strategic purposes. There is no cuneiform tablet in any surviving collection that advises ordinary Babylonians to avoid signing contracts, or to expect their personal conversations to go sideways during a planetary turning. The idea that retrograde creates personal chaos for individual people is not ancient. It is modern. The Babylonians were doing something sophisticated, but it was a different kind of sophistication than the version that shows up on your phone. The interpretive tradition continued to evolve as the Babylonian system flowed into Greek astronomy and then into what we now call Hellenistic astrology, the formal astrological system that emerged in Greco-Roman Egypt around the 1st century BCE. It was in this tradition that the concept acquired the name that stuck. The Latin term retrogradus, meaning backward step, became the standard word for the apparent reversal of a planet's motion, and the teaching that developed around it was built entirely on that image of stepping back over ground already covered. The prefix re is the entire key to the original retrograde teaching. Reconsider, reflect, revise, revisit, reconnect, review, rethink, redo. Every one of those words carries the same instruction. Go back over what came before. Check your work, look at what you missed the first time through. The ancient framework treated retrograde periods the way a careful editor treats a manuscript. You wrote the first draft during the direct motion period, when Mercury appeared to move forward. You made decisions, started projects, signed agreements, had conversations, and pushed things ahead. Then Mercury appeared to retrace its path across the sky, and the sky was telling you to do the same thing in your own life. Reread the contract before you finalize it. Revisit the conversation that felt unfinished. Reconnect with the person you lost touch with. Review the plan you set in motion and make sure nothing slipped through the cracks. Not because the cosmos was punishing you for moving too fast, but because you are human, and humans who move at speed inevitably miss things, and a periodic prompt to slow down and double-check is genuinely valuable. This interpretation was not limited to the Greco-Roman world. In the Vedic astrological tradition of India, which developed its own sophisticated system of planetary observation over thousands of years, retrograde planets are called Vakri, meaning crooked or twisted. But in Vedic practice, a Vakri planet is not considered weakened or malefic. It is often considered strengthened because its apparent reversal concentrates its energy. The instruction mirrors the Western tradition in different language. When a planet goes Vakri, the area of life it governs requires intensified attention, not avoidance. Arab and Persian astrologers of the medieval period, who preserved and expanded the Greek text while Europe was in its early medieval period, maintained a similarly balanced view. They classified retrograde planets as requiring extra care and deliberation, not as signals to abandon activity altogether. Across every major astrological tradition that studied retrograde with rigor, the conclusion pointed the same direction. Slow down, pay closer attention, review what you have already done. So how did we get from a practical reflection prompt to a 3-week dread festival? The answer is surprisingly recent. For most of recorded history, astrology was practiced by trained professionals who understood the astronomical foundations underneath the interpretive system. Whether you worked in the Hellenistic tradition of Alexandria, the Vedic tradition of India, or the Persian and Arabic schools that preserved and expanded the Greek text during the medieval period, you learned the astronomy first. You understood retrograde as one element within a dense, complex system of planetary interactions, not as an isolated catastrophe you could pull out of context and put on a graphic. The first major simplification happened in the 20th century, when astrology moved from professional practice to popular culture. Newspaper horoscope columns, which began in the 1930s in Britain, reduced the entire birth chart to a single sun sign and a few sentences of generic advice. The nuance of planetary aspects, house positions, and retrograde cycles could not survive that compression. And Mercury got hit hardest because its traditional rulership over communication, commerce, and short-distance travel meant that its retrograde could be linked to things every single person experiences daily. Saturn retrograde affects long-term structures and discipline. Jupiter retrograde affects growth and philosophy. Those are abstract. Mercury retrograde affects your text messages, your Wi-Fi, and your morning commute. That is immediate, personal, and relatable. Then social media finished the job. Platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook reward content that generates strong emotional responses. A post saying, "Mercury retrograde is a useful time to review your recent decisions," generates almost no engagement. It is calm. It is measured. It does not make anyone feel anything urgent. A post saying, "Mercury retrograde starts tomorrow. Brace yourself. Do not sign anything. Your ex is about to reappear. Technology will betray you," generates thousands of shares. It triggers anxiety, recognition, and the urge to warn friends. The incentive structure of social media selected for the most alarming interpretation and repeated it so many thousands of times that it became the accepted wisdom. The retrograde you see on your feed today is not ancient wisdom passed down through generations of careful practitioners. It is a modern invention, barely a few decades old in its current form, shaped by the attention economy and amplified by algorithms that reward emotional intensity over accuracy. This channel covers one spiritual concept at a time and traces it back to where it actually started, if that is something you would like to keep hearing. Subscribing is the simplest way to find the next one when it arrives. Now, there is one more piece of this puzzle that needs to be laid on the table, and it might be the most important one. Because you might be sitting there thinking, fine, the astronomy explains the illusion, and the history explains the distortion. But I have personally experienced strange things during Mercury retrograde. My phone did glitch. That conversation did go sideways. That trip did fall apart. How do you explain that? Fair question. And the answer comes not from astrology, but from cognitive science. There is a well-documented psychological phenomenon called the frequency illusion. It is sometimes informally called the Baader-Meinhof effect, a name it picked up from an online forum in the 1990s when one user happened to experience the illusion with that particular phrase and the label caught on. The phenomenon works like this. Once your brain has been primed to notice something, it begins flagging every instance of that thing while simultaneously ignoring the hundreds of times that thing does not occur. You hear an unfamiliar word for the first time, and then you hear it 3 more times that same week. You buy a particular model of car, and suddenly you see that model everywhere on the highway. The word was always being used. That car model was always on the road. Your attention filter changed, not the frequency of the thing itself. Mercury retrograde operates on exactly this principle. The moment someone tells you that retrograde causes communication breakdowns, technology failures, and travel disruptions, your brain activates a filter for those specific problems. Your email takes 3 extra seconds to load, something that happens routinely every week, and instead of ignoring it the way you normally would, you think Mercury retrograde. Your coworker misunderstands a message you sent, which happens in every workplace on every day of every month, and you attribute it to the planetary transit. Every minor frustration, every glitchy app, every miscommunication becomes confirmation. Meanwhile, the hundreds of things that went perfectly fine that same day receive 0 attention. They do not fit the narrative, so your brain discards them. Researchers have looked at this directly. Studies examining emergency room admission rates, automobile accident frequency, and psychiatric episode numbers during Mercury retrograde periods have found no statistically significant increase compared to non-retrograde periods. The data does not support the claim that more things go wrong when Mercury appears to move backward. What the data does suggest is that people notice more problems and assign more significance to ordinary problems during retrograde because their attention has been primed to look for trouble. Your experience during retrograde is real. You genuinely did notice more issues, but you noticed them because you were looking for them, not because a planet 80 million miles away rearranged the fabric of your Tuesday. And here is where something genuinely useful emerges from all of this. Something that brings the entire story full circle. Because even without Mercury transmitting disruptive energy across millions of miles of space, the retrograde cycle provides something that modern life desperately lacks. A recurring, structured prompt to slow down and pay attention. Think about how you actually live. You move through weeks and months at speed, processing decisions, conversations, financial commitments, and relationship dynamics as they arrive, rarely pausing to look back at what you might have missed. You signed that agreement and moved on. You had that conversation and never revisited it. You committed to that project and plowed forward without checking whether the foundation was solid. Modern culture rewards relentless forward motion. It treats reflection as a luxury, something you will get around to when things calm down. Things never calm down. Mercury retrograde, stripped of the fear and the superstition, offers exactly what the original tradition intended. A scheduled pause, a 3-week window, 3 to 4 times per year, when a visible, recurring astronomical event says, stop moving forward for a moment. Go back over your recent ground. What did you miss? When you hear that a retrograde period is approaching, treat it as a trigger for deliberate review. Reread contracts and agreements you signed in the previous few months. Revisit conversations that ended abruptly or felt unfinished and follow up on them. Reconnect with people you have been meaning to call or write. Review your bank statements, medical appointments, and insurance policies. Reconsider any decision you made quickly under pressure and ask whether it still makes sense with distance. Back up your digital files and photos, not because Mercury will corrupt them, but because you were probably going to do it eventually, and now you have a reason, and because the prompt is tied to an observable astronomical cycle, something you can actually watch happening in the night sky, rather than a random notification buzzing on your phone. It carries a natural weight and rhythm that makes it sustainable. Every culture that built its calendar around celestial observations understood this. The rhythm of the sky provides structure for the rhythm of life. You will not do a thorough review because your calendar app told you to. You might actually do one because the sky reminded you, the same way it reminded the Babylonians, the Hellenistic Greeks, the Vedic astrologers, and the medieval Arab scholars who all looked up and paid attention to what the planets were doing. There is something especially valuable about having this kind of prompt arrive through a natural rhythm rather than through a crisis. Retrograde review is not crisis management. It is maintenance. It is the practice of periodically going back through the areas of your life that tend to drift on autopilot. The finances, the health decisions, the relationships, the agreements that were signed under one set of circumstances and may no longer reflect where you actually stand, and giving them a second look before they become problems. That practice has value at every age, but it compounds over the decades as the number of agreements, commitments, and relationships you are maintaining grows larger and more complex. The Babylonian astronomers had this rhythm built into their calendar. The Hellenistic astrologers had it. The Vedic practitioners had it. It is available to anyone willing to use it. Mercury is not your enemy. It never was. It is a small, fast, rocky planet roughly 3,000 miles across, doing what it has done since the solar system formed, orbiting the sun on its tight inside track, occasionally appearing to retrace its steps when viewed from Earth's moving platform. The fear was added recently by people who benefit from your anxiety, the original observers, the ones who pressed reed styluses into wet clay and watched the sky from temple rooftops 26 centuries ago, would have told you something much simpler. Pay attention, look back, check your work, and then keep going. That is what Mercury retrograde actually means. It always has been. If this changed how you think about retrograde, the next video is about Venus retrograde, a transit that happens roughly every 18 months and quietly reshapes your relationships, your values, and your sense of self-worth in ways Mercury never could. That video is on screen now.